Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, brought to you by the OJJDP NMRC, the National Mentoring Resource Center. My name is Delia Hagan, and I'm joining from Maynard, Massachusetts. It's a beautiful fall day here again in Maynard. So welcome to everyone. We know we've got a lot of folks from all over the country and more joining every second right now. So we're going to give folks just a couple more minutes to hop on, get situated. And we'll ask that while you do, if you could kindly type your name, maybe your first name and where you're joining from. And then if you're affiliated with any type of mentoring or youth development program or any other social service or any other sort of way of entering into this conversation, it'd just be helpful for us to get to know who you are, and what your sort of perspective is, what your role is in this field and in this work. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And again, we're just going to give just a couple more minutes to let folks join before we, or maybe just one more minute before we jump into our conversation. So I see a lot of folks joining from all over the country, all different types of programs. Welcome. We have folks who are working in youth services, juvenile justice, legal services, I'm seeing, after school programs. So many different angles. So wow, some MSWs in the house. Shout out to the social workers. Wow, wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And we're going to go ahead and jump right in. We have some fantastic panelists. I can't wait for you to meet. They're going to share a lot of really important and relevant information with you today. So I won't keep you too long from that. I just want to share a little bit of housekeeping and a little bit about the project that has brought this webinar to you, and then we're going to go in and let our panelists take it away. So, as you may have noticed, all attendees have been muted for best sound on today's webinar. However, we do want to hear from you. And for this particular topic, we spent a lot of time going through the questions that all of you sent in advance. So we appreciate when you registered. We took a really long look at the questions you submitted. What do you want to know about this topic? And we actually prepared kind of a curated Q&A at the end of the webinar to respond to some of the most relevant questions that will really help advance today's conversation. However, we do want to hear what your thoughts are in real time. So if you want to use that Q&A tab and share, what questions are coming to mind as the panelists are speaking, please do go ahead and use that function. For today's webinar, we are talking about a very sensitive topic. We want to be really aware of the language we're using and the potential triggering nature of this topic. So we are going to be, very sort of selecting around the questions that we do raise up. And so if you do have a question that doesn't get answered after today's webinar, we'll share some contact information that you can reach out to try to get your questions answered. We just have so many folks on the call and so many great questions, we probably won't be able to get to all of them. But please go ahead and use that Q&A function, as we feel like that's really the best place for you to share your questions as they come up throughout this conversation. Martha O'Connell, as you see on your screen, is going to be queuing up questions to share with panelists during the Q&A portion, and I'm going to be reading those out. So again, looking forward to hearing what some of those questions are that pop up. But again, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. If you're new to Zoom, there's that control panel that can really kind of show you all the different options that you have for how to interact with us. And we're in a few moments going to be using some polls as well. So another way for you to engage and tell us a little bit more about yourself. So moving on to the next slide, we are going to just remind you that today's webinar is being recorded. So if you can't catch everything, you don't have to take furious notes. In about a week, we're going to be sending out that webinar to you, that recording, and a copy of the slides as well. So you'll have all this information. You don't need to scramble. We're also going to be posting these materials on the NMRC website. If you're not familiar with it, I'm going to share it with you in a moment. And just another reminder, I want to tell you that we are looking to always improve these webinars that we do through the NMRC. So we have a really quick 3-minute survey that's going to pop up right after the webinar concludes. And we hope you'll just take a few minutes to share with us your feedback and what you'd like to see next from the center. So next up, our agenda. What are we going to do today? We're going to be hearing from two fantastic organizations that are doing really incredible work with young people who have been impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. Those organizations are My Life, My Choice and Youth Collaboratory. Both of them are funded by OJJDP to do this specific work. So they're going to be sharing their very different models, their different approaches, and some different kind of information about the context within which they do this work. And both of them are bringing just very different perspectives, both very relevant to different programs and things that you may be interested in. So we're excited to kind of give you this overview of, what do you need to know about this topic? What do you need to know about mentoring specifically for young people who have been impacted by sexual exploitation? They're going to be talking about resources. They're going to be talking about, how to identify potential risk factors for young people, as well as how do you actually customize survivor-led programming for youth who are impacted. So a lot of different topics wrapped up in what you're about to hear. We're going to definitely focus a lot of time on answering questions. We want to be responsive to the things that you need and what you want to take away from today. And then we're going to offer you some further resources. That's what we have in store for you. So a couple other quick things. As I said, this webinar is brought to you by the OJJDP National Mentoring Resource Center. This is a little bit about OJJDP. Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, partners with OJJDP through a cooperative agreement where we deliver the OJJDP NMRC to the field. And this center, the NMRC, really builds on OJJDP's history and leadership and investments in quality youth mentoring. And this is a topic that OJJDP is deeply invested in. If you don't know about the National Mentoring Resource Center, we definitely hope you check it out. We have a newly redesigned website, www.nationalmentoringresourcecenter.org. And you'll see just really anything you could possibly imagine around best practices for mentoring on that website. So really encourage you to check that out. There's tons of research to practice information, practitioner, really handy, kind of ready to use templates, things like that for your youth mentoring program, if that's something you're looking to get involved in. We have a research board that vets all of those materials, as well as no cost training and technical assistance, courtesy of OJJDP, that enables programs to really kind of receive that one-on-one coaching to actually apply those practices to their programming. So if you haven't yet engaged with the center, we really, really encourage you to check it out. And this is just a little bit about Mentor and who we are. We have tons of state affiliates across the country. If you haven't looked up your local Mentor affiliate, we hope you do. We are often known for our Elements of Effective Practice for Mentoring publication and for bringing folks together to help close the mentoring gap. So it's part of the reason that we do this work in partnership with OJJDP. So now I would like to, before we introduce our fantastic panelists, we really want to get to know you. So we're going to launch a couple of polls. This is really the way that we get to know our audience. We've got a big group today. And our first question for our audience today is, have you received any training up until now on the topic of commercial sexual exploitation of children? So I'm going to launch this poll, and I'm going to give you a few, maybe a little less than a minute, about 30 seconds to respond. So go ahead and chime in. Have you ever received any training prior to today on this topic? I'm going to give you 5 more seconds to respond. And let's show our results. So it looks about 61%, 60% or so of folks on the line have received some form of training before on this topic. That's good to hear. 34% no, and then a few are not sure. That's very helpful information for us as we go into the conversation. Now we'd like to launch a second poll. And this is around whether your program is currently screening for sexual exploitation. So are you asking questions of your service users in whatever way that you coordinate services or engage with young people? Are you doing any form of screening for sexual exploitation? I'm going to give a couple more seconds to respond, and then we'll go ahead and share our results. Here we are. So we have about almost the same percentage, 60% or so almost, are currently screening, about 27% not so much, and 16% don't know. That's helpful info for us. And finally, we're going to ask you a little bit more about whether you are currently doing some mentoring for young people who are impacted by this issue. So do you currently incorporate some sort of mentoring into the programming that you do? We know folks are engaging with youth in lots of different ways. We already saw the real breadth of different roles that you all play, but is there some sort of mentoring component in the work you do? So just a couple more seconds. and we'll end this poll. Share the results. So this is interesting. We've got about almost 40% of folks say yes, they're incorporating mentoring, and about half say they're not. And that's really interesting. And about almost 10% say they're not sure. So maybe somewhere on the spectrum there. But that's really helpful to hear. And I think what you'll learn today is that mentoring really has a unique power to be just healing for young people who have experienced commercial sexual exploitation, and also to be preventative for a lot of young people who may be at risk. So it's a really helpful entry point into our conversation to just hear a little bit more about you all and how you engage with this topic already in your work. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today, and I'm going to start with Dejamir Petway from Youth Collaboratory. Dejamir was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, and this work began for her as an advocate or consultant, both locally and nationally. And Martha, if you want to move to the next slide, you can see a little bit more about Dejamir. During her career, she's also provided training and technical assistance and support for agencies to develop and maintain authentic, equitable partnerships with young people. She uses her expertise to advance and advocate for the voices of youth and survivors in her current work, which revolves around preventing and addressing commercial sexual exploitation of youth. Among her expertise are foster care, youth homelessness, commercial sexual exploitation of children, mentoring, and youth leadership design and development. As well as direct care work, she has done policy advocacy locally and nationally, advocating for survivor-led and policy change. And now I'll introduce Joy Thompson, Director of Programs at Youth Collaboratory. Joy Thompson has many years of experience developing and implementing best practice programs from the ground up in the education, mentoring, and anti-trafficking fields, and developing and maintaining working partnerships with service providers, faith-based organizations, and state governmental agencies. Joy's experience providing direct services to child survivors of commercial sexual exploitation, development of CSEC, which is the acronym that you may hear us use for commercial sexual exploitation of children, short-term residential therapeutic programming, and providing training for service providers and law enforcement informs her approach to her work. Joy is deeply passionate about working to spread awareness about and decrease demand for the commercial sexual exploitation of children, as well as addressing the systemic inequalities that contribute to the disproportionate impact of CSEC on Black girls. Joy has facilitated specialized training locally and nationally for hundreds of community members, prospective mentors, healthcare providers, social service workers, and numerous community-based organizations. Joy holds a BA from San Francisco State University, is a certified mental health first aid instructor, and a member of the Alameda County Anti-Trafficking Task Force, and serves as the vice chair of the board of directors at Justice at Last, a nonprofit law firm that provides pro bono legal services for survivors of human trafficking. Joy currently serves as director of programs, building community and addressing exploitation and trafficking at Youth Collaboratory, where she leads strategy and visioning for preventing and ending human trafficking, enhancing mentoring program practices spanning 25 states, and ending homelessness for Black and LGBTQ+ youth. Welcome, Joy, and welcome, Dejamir. Thank you so much for being on with us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Ann Wilkinson, our other panelist from My Life, My Choice. Ann Wilkinson is the Director of Mentoring Services at My Life, My Choice, a program of Justice Resource Institute. Since coming to My Life, My Choice in 2005, Ms. Wilkinson co-leads the Survivor Mentoring Program, in which commercially sexually exploited and high-risk youth are paired with trained adult survivors for one-on-one long-term relationships. Further, Ms. Wilkinson works with service providers to augment and fine-tune their services for this vulnerable population. In addition, Ms. Wilkinson coaches and supports the Survivor Empowerment Team in their professional development and brings a wealth of personal and professional expertise, including over 20 years in the fields of trafficking, domestic violence, addiction, and HIV services. Ms. Wilkinson holds a Bachelor of Science in Human Services and is currently pursuing a master's degree in social work. Welcome, Ann, and thank you for being with us today as well. So now I'm going to turn it over to Joy Thompson from Youth Collaboratory to kick off our conversation. Welcome, Joy.
Thank you so much, Delia, and it's so good to be here. Wonderful to see so many folks represented here for this super vital conversation that we're going to have today. So we're going to jump right in and start with a little bit about Youth Collaboratory. So Youth Collaboratory serves organizations and professionals working to improve the lives of young people, their families, and communities. We harness the power of the youth services community to innovate, evaluate, and drive effective strategies that assure the safety and well-being of youth and young adults, unlocking their limitless potential. We have three primary focus areas. We are focused on coordinated community responses to youth and young adult homelessness, preventing and addressing relationship violence, sexual exploitation, and trafficking of youth, and supporting opportunities for young people to build community with family, peers, and others to enhance their assets and explore their strengths and develop lasting connections. You can learn more about us by visiting our site at youthcollaboratory.org. So basically, we are intermediaries. We work with folks who are doing direct services. It's a short version of that. And we can go to the next slide, perfect. Some objectives. So we have a really short amount of time for a wide subject matter. So we're going to do our best to give you a brief overview of the commercial sexual exploitation of children. You'll hear us refer to CSEC, and that refers to the topic. And also it could refer to a person. So when you hear us say CSEC or CSE, that's what we're talking about. We will discuss implications for mentoring programs and share a few considerations for working with youth impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. And there will be additional resources provided at the end. To get us started, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to my colleague, Deshamir.
Thank you so much, Joyen. Here we are to the next slide. So really quickly, we do want to give you all this definition, and it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sexual act in which the commercial sexual act is induced by force, fraud, or corrosion, in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. And we also listed some examples for you all as much as child trafficking, sexual exploitation of children, child pornography, child sex tourism involving commercial sexual activity, escort services, online sexual exploitation, gang-based sexual exploitation, stripping, phone sex lines, and then familial sexual exploitation. And we can go on to the next slide. So we also wanted to give you more context around what do we mean around force, fraud, or corrosion. So that could be, we just gave you some examples. I'm not going to read all of these off, but it's for force, it could be rape, beatings, taking ID passports, depriving of food and basic necessities, fraud, promises of home good, education, job, promises of love and companionship, promises of a better life. Corrosion, threats to a person's family member or pet, isolation, psychological abuse, and gaslighting. And we can go to the next slide. So with child sexual exploitation comes individual risk factors. We all know that anybody at any age can be victimized, but some certain characteristics increase a person's more risk value. So that could be their age, their early childhood sexual abuse, system involvement, housing instability, poverty, exposure to violence, being a person of color, LGBTQ adults or gender non-conforming, those who struggle with mental health challenges, and systematic oppressions. And then I'm gonna go pass it to Joy to talk more into risk factors.
Thank you, Deshamir. So sometimes, a lot of times, especially since we're funded by Department of Justice and OJJDP, you'll hear us say risk factors, and you'll hear alternatively, sometimes people say target factors. And so we can use those interchangeably. And just to note, just to piggyback off of what Delia mentioned earlier, is that we are super intentional about the language that we're using, because as you all know, in the mentoring field, our thoughts become our language, and our language becomes what we write down about our youth and young adults. And so even though we are working with youth who may be impacted by CSEC, we know that we want to see them as bigger than the things that are impacting them and bigger than their trauma. So just want to make a note about that. We can go ahead into the next slide. So Deshamir talked a little bit about the individual risk factors like age, right? Age is the primary risk factor for a child sexual exploitation, obviously. And then there's all the things that are happening in that individual's life, but there are intersecting oppressions and intersecting challenges that create even more targets for someone. So in addition to someone having, say, being a young person experiencing system involvement, they could also be experiencing relationship issues. So if they are exposed to violence at an early age or experience trauma at an early age, that of course impacts someone's ability to have safe relationships, because it impacts your perception of what a safe relationship is. Also, the community that they are in that it impacts their experiences as well. And then the bigger piece is the societal influence. So when we think about who is disproportionately impacted by sexual exploitation, then we have to take in consideration things like racism, heterosexism, homophobia, the disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous, and people of color and LGBTQ plus youth. And so someone could have multiple identities and multiple experiences that increase their probability of being targeted by an exploiter. So in some places you'll say you'll hear that it's a risk factor, and in other conversations you'll hear that it is someone is being targeted because they are being perceived as having less support. So we just, again, want to be mindful of our language. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Delia to get us started on a discussion.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I think we'd really like at this point to just hear a little bit more from you, Joy and Dejamir, about what advice would you give mentoring programs that have not knowingly supported youth impacted by sexual exploitation?
Sure, thank you. And I would, also want to include Anne from My Life, My Choice in this conversation as well. Ms. Anne, if you have some things that you would like to offer, I can get us started though and say that some things that I think it's important for folks to keep in mind is first starting with that level setting in education. So we see with this group that many of you, a large percentage of you, have already had some type of training on sexual exploitation and working specifically with youth who have been impacted, but being sure that the full staff, everybody from the front desk to your intake, match support specialists, your board members, everyone has a level understanding of what commercial sexual exploitation is, what the signs are, and some of those target or risk factors. I also always want to lift up partnership, that the work can seem daunting, especially if you're doing it on your own, but that there are likely many people in your community who are already leaning in heavily to this work, and that you want to make those partnerships and have connections, especially connections to those in juvenile justice, child welfare, community mental health, housing programs. It's really going to take an improved systemic collaboration and response for us to prevent and to continue to work to stop trafficking. That ongoing training. So like Delia mentioned, many of us are versed in those elements of effective mentoring practices, but including in those practices, just beefing up the places where, like that ongoing training. So you have the pre-match training and the ongoing training, but in that ongoing training, that continued mentor screening and mentee screening needs to be happening. So increasing those practices to consider this population or enhancing those practices to serve this population is going to be really helpful. And then being sure that you have a process for screening youth that you're using across the board. So I see some people in the chat are lifting up the See It tool, which I know is amazing, comes from West Coast Clinic here in California. There are plenty of others, but being sure that you have a tool and being sure that you have training to use that tool in a way that doesn't increase harm or create a barrier for services for those youth and scare them away and their parents away, but really work on that training and that level setting is what I would add. Dejamir, Ms. Ann, do you have anything to add to that?
You kind of like stole half of my talking points there, but no, I just want to echo for sure really quickly around like the organizational trainings and responses. So even if you're like your mentoring program is not aware that a youth has been impacted by sexual exploitation, just making sure there's some kind of training and appropriate next steps that can be taken to make sure that, like Joy just said, like under no circumstances that the services cause further harm or become re-exploitive to that youth or young adult. So Joy kind of stole all my talking points.
I'm so sorry.
You did. You covered a lot there, Joy. I think too, the one thing that I would add, and we've talked about this before, is just meeting the youth where they're at and sort of making sure that you're open and using language that supports the young person. And it's really, really important that we not engage with our own ideas and our own judgments about what is or is not the way a young person should be, right? So just being really aware of that, supporting them from where they're at, being mindful of language, not saying things like promiscuous and, prostitution, just being really mindful of our language and how we see them, and that we don't imply that they somehow chose to participate in this child abuse, because that's what it is, right? So yeah. I'm going to stop there because I know Joy and Deshamir have a lot to cover.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thanks, Deshamir and Joy, for answering that question so comprehensively. And I know we're going to hear more about it in a few minutes, but other question we wanted to pause and ask at this moment is, what are some methods of supporting and engaging with youth who have been impacted by CSEC or sexual exploitation? So building off what you just shared, how would you go about maybe even thinking about when you first become aware of a young person being impacted? How might you start supporting and engaging them?
Maybe I'll go first this time. I think the first thing you want to do is just really listen to them, and sort of be aware of how your expressions, and sort of, to show that you are concerned, but not, again, no judgment, to really listen to them and sort of meet them where they're at, and to be educated, to attend CSEC trainings, learn about CSEC, learn about working with victims and responding to victims, and learn about active listening and motivational interviewing, and on and on and on, and be, as many of us are, be trained about how to engage and how you can best support them and not further cause harm.
Yeah, and I just want to piggy off that again, to my point. I'm sorry, as you know, many people have like cats and dogs, be able to stay at home. I have children. So if you hear my little ones in the background, excuse me now, my son just came home early for school. But to piggyback off what Ann said, it's like, with that trauma-informed care that we always talk about, I always lift up having trauma-informed partnerships with youth and young adults who have been impacted. So with, being trauma-informed, there needs to be like that partnership as well. So, and that what comes with that trust that we need to have in youth and young adults. And in order to best help youth heal, we have to understand not only trauma, but the trauma that they've personally experienced, because everybody trauma looks different, and how traumatic events, how that affected that young person. And this is always very important when we're talking about pushing like that recovery and that resilience, and doing our part by ensuring that young people are not re-traumatized again, because I always go through this re-traumatization through their experiences within systems. We also need to listen, like to Anne just said, and elevate their own voices in all aspects in our work. And sometimes with this work, we can always find ourselves assuming, we know what's best for that young person, and we just make those caseworker plans or whatever for that young person, instead of just the simple act of just listening to that young person can really go a long way.
Thank you. I think I will add just a few things, because you all covered that so beautifully. I think to Deshamir's point around building trust, that's something that I hear people ask about a lot, like, how do I build trust? And I always respond to people, my experiences have taught me, just like with adults, that youth don't owe us their trust, that the best thing that we can do is work to become trustworthy. And the way that we can do that is to just kind of practice being in authentic relationships in all the ways. So it's not just we're trying to be an authentic partnership with youth, but that we show up authentically every day, and that will increase our ability to show up authentically with youth. So I just would add that onto it, and I will zip it until the next discussion question. We can go to the next slide. So implications for mentoring programs. It's important for us to recognize and begin to understand commercial sexual exploitation, and be sure that all of us in our organizations have a similar understanding of what it is. And I do want to pause. Nope, I'll keep going. Recognize and begin to understand culture, because we know that there are some identities, some people who are disproportionately impacted. And so when we say recognize and begin to understand commercial exploitation and culture, that also includes Deshamir's point of including folks who have that lived expertise. Hire them, not just for focus groups, but include them in your staff and listen to them, and be sure that the experience is a sustainable one for them. as well. So understanding and having those relationships, if your organization does not, partnering with folks who do deeply dig into work around culture and commercial sexual exploitation, and recognize and begin to understand trauma and trauma manifestations. Deshamir started to talk about that. And so a lot of us have a concept of trauma, but sometimes in mentoring, I've seen some programs who will flat out not take some youth because of their previous experiences, or they'll will refer, unfortunately, sometimes we're using deficit-based language and we're not seeing through the behavior to what's happening. We're just seeing maybe a young person who may be displaying signs of a bad attitude when really that's a manifestation of trauma and they're protecting themselves. So we have to, especially in this day and age, be more responsive than we are reactive. And that's part of what we mean by understanding trauma and trauma manifestations, and also being able to self-check. A lot of times we're looking at how to teach youth how to regulate, when we as adults also have to be able to share with mentors how to regulate when things get a little spicy, because people have had some really intense experiences, and if you are in relationship with them, it means that they have survived some difficult experiences, and it's going to take a while for them to be comfortable and drop the behaviors that protected them for a long time. So it's important that we have a deep understanding of trauma and trauma manifestations. Recognize and begin to understand stages of change. I know many of you may be familiar with that, but also compare that to the match cycle. Like, what happens in a regular match cycle? First, things may be exciting. 3 months in, things may change a little bit. People may push boundaries, especially when you're working with youth who have been impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. You want to be sure that you enhance your training for mentors around boundaries, because they're going to want to do all of these amazing things, and we want them to maintain their role as a mentor and utilize their supports so that they maintain in their lane and everybody does what they do best in support of the youth. I would add to integrate these concepts in your practice again of the effective elements of mentoring at every stage. So kind of looking at, if you're already working with youth and you've identified that you are working with youth who are impacted, how are you utilizing those effective methods specifically for this population? Where are their gaps and what are your goals to increase your capacity to serve these youth? And with that, I'm going to pass it to Delia.
All right, so our next pause for discussion here is around this next question, which is what about the logistical, legal, and other institutional implications for youth who have experienced CSEC? How do programs support young people who have been criminalized or stigmatized? So, Anne, Deshamir, Joy, anyone want to jump in and respond to this question?
Okay, I think I'm elected to go first here. What I would strongly suggest you do is find out what sort of legal supports are in your state. For example, Massachusetts, we have the Safe Harbor Act that protects youth from being criminalized as a result of commercial, youth, this is under the age of 18, from being criminalized, let me say that slowly, and that sort of reduces the stigmatization that could occur in our state. The other thing is we have to shift our own language in our community and begin to see our youth as victims rather than a child who chose it. And so if you attend one of our trainings, we talk about the teen prostitute versus a commercially sexually exploited youth. The only thing different about the two is the language. And we see one as a victim and one sort of as responsible. And we really have to work on changing how we do that, doing advocacy in our counties and our states to make sure that there are laws that support and protect our youth. We also have a multidisciplinary team response here in Massachusetts, so that if a youth is identified as being a victim of CSEC, There is a team that automatically comes together and provides wraparound supports to these youth. And that's really, really important. But we're really kind of blessed on the East Coast, especially in Massachusetts. And I think only 30 states have the Safe Harbor Act. So I would encourage you to, get together with some folks and create some advocacy work. And become an ally for the cause if you haven't been personally affected by CSEC in a young person, then maybe to just become an ally and help us work on the criminalization, which will then, in fact, reduce the stigmatization of victims of CSEC.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I just want to jump in really quick around the second half of this question around how do programs support young people who have been criminalized and stigmatized. I think initially just by having that understanding of the trauma, I'm gonna always go back to the trauma that young person may have or may not have endured with the system. And sometimes with like youth who have been impacted, organizations, they immediately want to jump to the report and then bring it in law enforcement, but instead taking time to really just focus on that healing and having those proper steps that it's going to need to help them deal with the criminalization that they may even be going through right now that those youth young adults may have faced, and just be really truly ready to walk alongside and support the youth and young adult where they're at in their healing journey and building back up that trust with the system that may have failed them. That's what I was trying to say. It was hard to get that out. And then that's all I really want to say.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Deshamir. And I would add, kind of echo some of the same things that you all are saying, is to continue to become educated on the laws in your area and partnerships and identifying your champions in the juvenile justice kind of ecosystem. There are definitely some people who are more aware than others. And fierce advocacy. So what can we do as individuals and collectively, what is your organization doing to act as fierce advocates in this movement to end trafficking and commercial exploitation for youth? I always want to say hire people with lived expertise because they're going to be able to help you with that lens of, okay, this may be like, we may be as program folks shifting to, okay, what do we need, what form, what connection needs to happen? But someone who has been and experienced that may be able to help that young person with what they're going through immediately. And Ms. Ann is going to talk a lot more about that. But in terms of connecting them with resources, getting more education about the common legal needs for people who have experienced this. It can include criminal defense, records clearance, education rights, healthcare rights, identity theft, so many different things. So people make the assumption that all they need is criminal defense, but there's quite a few other things that folks need. Again, it's really helpful to have strong partnerships and stakeholders within juvenile justice, but you also want to be sure that you have alternatives to engaging law enforcement, because many people don't know that there are community groups that can come out and support. There are alternatives and things that you can do, but if you have to engage law enforcement, how do you do it in a way that doesn't cause increased harm? How are you transparent with the youth to say, this is what is about to happen, this is who is coming, I'm going to call an advocate to be with you? How do you handle that in this landscape that we're in right now when there's so much racial violence happening? Also being sure that people have an understanding of restorative practices and restorative inquiry. So asking someone, for instance, what happened instead of why did you do this? So being sure that we have training and the different language in ways that are not punitive to communicate with people about what's happening in their lives. And I'll pass it to Deshamir. You're muted.
I'm muted. That would have helped. So yes, really quickly, I just want to bring up a couple of these bullet points when dealing with the criminalization of youth impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. And the first one, increase your awareness of the root causes of oppression and sexual exploitation. This also requires really a commitment to organizational transformation and really addressing some of your current practices and policies and procedures through an intersectional and justice-centered lens. It also requires a mission-driven commitment to ensure that all of your organizational leadership and staff engage in trainings and develop practices that examine and interrogate the implicit and explicit systems of bias and oppression. Increase your awareness of the law set up to protect youth and child survivors of sexual exploitation. And, Joy and Ann did a really good job speaking to like knowing your safe harbor laws. And, just in case you even get a youth, that has been a youth or young adult that has been criminalized, who are being criminalized, I'm sorry, that you have those proper use of resources and referrals to best help that young person out. I just talked about policies and practices, but also hiring that skill people with lived expertise, which also include your youth and young adults. They really need to be positioned as experts with their feedback, reflections, and questions about their different experiences, and having that expertise as a valuable resource for a curriculum, program, and policy change moving forward. And then the last one I just want to hit on really quick is making strategic partnerships and working together. So that also means getting into that collaborative mindset, making sure that you are ready to come into it fully as a partnership. And that can lead to more efficient use of resources and better communication and greater impact for the organization as a whole, whoever is involved. So that's all I have for you all. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Ann, wonderful Ann, to dive deeper into her portion.
Thank you guys so much. This is really great. I'm with great folks leading the charge and educating on CSEC. And I'm going to talk about my agency and what we do in our work. So who we are. As you guys know, I'm from My Life, My Choice. I've been with My Life, My Choice for, 16, 17 years. When I started at My Life, My Choice, there were 3 of us. There is now 33 of us. I'm also a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation, and I'm an expert in the field of CSEC and working with youth. Do I say next slide or? Okay, cool. Okay, so our core programs are survivor empowerment, our prevention solutions, and training and advocacy. And then I think if we go to the next, I should probably be ahead of you. Okay, good. We're gonna do one at a time. So survivor mentoring, and we laugh at this, we call it the secret sauce, but every time I say secret sauce, I think of McDonald's and the commercial. But our secret sauce is that when a youth meets a survivor for the first time, the survivor tells a version of their story to the young person, right? And often we highlight something that we may know about the youth or areas that we know that are relatable for the young person, and we tell them. And in that moment, a bond happens. We can't name it. We just call it secret sauce. That is something that happens. And for many of you that work with young people, you know that young people go by what you do, not by what you say. They want to know, what did you do? And so this is why we do this way. Many say, like we do, well, you're talking about you. Well, actually, I'm telling my story to teach this young person. So my story becomes a tool that's used to connect with them and let them know that I came from a place, right? And I survived a place, and I'm sort of recovered in that area and can move on and live my best life. The hope is that I interrupt the process for this young person, and they won't be a young adult when they get out. They'll still be able to have their teen or their young years, right? And shift their trajectory back to where they were meant to be all along. Okay. All right. And then our survivor mentor model is sort of 3-pronged. It's lived experience, right? Number 1, it's what we've all gone through, and we're trained in a way. I want to also say mentors are trained in a way to tell their story in a way that's used as a tool. And if at any time you are not, there's an area that you are not strong in, right, and able to talk, we don't talk about that. This is all about helping this young person, and we can't help if we don't have. So our lived experience is 1. Practice wisdom from the field. What is practice wisdom? Practice wisdom is working with these young people, gives us an opportunity to practice and use our experience, and then it becomes wisdom because we're able to use these tools repetitively with other youth as we serve other young people. And the other part is based on the latest research and ongoing training. So we're constantly trained. We are Mentors are, motivational interviewing, stages of change, PFS, psychological first aid, CSEC 101, advanced clinical training, residential CSEC, everything is CSEC in the world we learn. That's sort of how we're able to do this work. And it continues to, as we grow and evolve in the world of CSEC and learn, we are also being trained as we go along. So we're constantly learning and developing new tools to use with the young people to hopefully end exploitation. Okay, so survivor empowerment, there's different parts of us. So there's the mentoring program. Now we have an intensive case management team that does the services outside of the mentoring, like housing and education and, housing and, food banks, and helping them just access many, many things that their families may need that may really impact them in such a way that they may need to continue to participate in being exploited. And so we're going to try to provide as many services as we can to help reduce the risk of them having to return to being exploited. There's also leadership development for them. They're part of a leadership corps. We also have a program, we have a leadership corps that's about 10 weeks. We also have 8-week grow, which is getting ready to grow into being an adult. Any youth 16 and over, we have that for them. We also have community building where we bring the youth together. Thanks to COVID, we've had to really be creative about how to bring the young people together now, since we are sort of restricted, but we've been able to still meet with them. We're still doing community building. We come together, we do a lot of, a soul food dinner night and Christmas party. We're doing this stuff virtually right now, but it supports them and helps them to engage in their community and use community resources. We also, collaborate with other agencies and have events. We also have a yearly youth summit where they're going to different workshops. We want them to experience that and facilitate. And it's important to say that any of these groups or any of these events that our youth attend, such as the summit, the leadership corps, grow, they are paid a stipend for every group that they attend. They also receive a bonus because we want them to know that even we are not going to exploit you in any kind of way. We want to make sure you're compensated for your work. And the difference is we're not going to ask you to do anything that you don't want to do in return. We're not going to exploit you in any kind of way. The other service that we now offer is therapy services for youth who need clinical supports. And that's really been helpful too, especially where there are stigmas about, having therapy, talking to people outside. What happens in the house stays in the house. So we have this service, and often the mentor, or I've even done, we will accompany them to their first couple of visits so that they build a rapport. And the other thing is because we trust our clinical team, they trust them. And so as their mentor, I am not the only person that they are connected to. There is a team. And again, what we do at My Life, My Choice reflects how we want them to move in the community. There are many people that you will have access to. We want you to have healthy communications with them all. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and so what we do, we know that it works. Why? Because there was a 3-year study conducted by BU, Boston University School of Public Health, and Northeastern School of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And the National Institute of Justice funded this. And over 3 years, 41 youth from Massachusetts were surveyed prior to starting, 6 months and again at 1 year. And 96% of these youth identified as female, 2% as male, and 2% as non-binary. Next slide. Key results, and click again. I hope there we go. They're 3 times less likely to be exploited. 61% decrease in depression, 40% decrease in opioid use, 20% increase in the ability to use coping skills, 54% decrease in arrests or police detainments, 1.4 times more likely to have adequate social support. And these are very important to, these are very important to note, because we really wanted to know what we did, if it was working, and we got proof of that, and we felt really confident about that the survivor mentoring program works, and it can be a bit controversial for some people, but it really worked, and we're really proud of that. And now we go to the next slide. And what our mentors are taught, or master, for lack of a better word, are the core competencies of survivorship, boundaries, CSEC expertise, professionalism, recovery from CSEC, and collaboration. And there are subsets to each one of those. And there is no way we have enough time for me to take you through all of the core competencies of mentoring. However, it is really important to mention that these are the 6 sort of headers for each one. And it's really important to this work. And our mentors are trained from the first 90 days of employment throughout 2 years, actually, to really learn and master sort of these competencies, and then maybe go on as senior survivor mentors, and then to different areas. But this is where we get all our good stuff at. All right. Building survivor leaders. And you're gonna click some more, so because I hate to go, I hate to go ahead of the slide. And this is not good for this particular setting, but so what our mentors do is they do get supervision and support. And the supervision and support that they get is they have a clinical supervisor that will review each case with the youth that they are mentoring. And they also have a coach who is a survivor who will help them with their survivorship. Many of us that work in the field, and because we talk about our own personal stories, we have to make sure that our mentors are getting what they need in order to be able to deliver effective services to the youth that they serve. So they're given a lot of supervision and support, professional development, as I mentioned already, attending a lot of training, but also professional development for their own personal goals, right? So like right now, I'm going to be attending Simmons for my master's degree in social work. And many of our mentors are in undergrad or graduate programs in the fields that they would like to become professionals in. And hopefully they'll stay at My Life, My Choice forever, but that's a whole nother thing. Okay, so, and then we definitely have survivor-led hiring and onboarding. And I think I just saw a statistic today that 54% of our staff is survivors. And so we are definitely a survivor-led agency. And then I can't say that without saying the last bullet on here, and that is the importance of allyship. It is really important to have folks that work with you that are allies if they're not survivors, people who really want to make a difference and stand out. And our co-executive director, Lisa Goldblatt Grace, who is also the co-founder of My Life, My Choice, is one of the biggest allies at our agency. And we would not be able to do our work without the many allies on the team at My Life, My Choice. So although it's survivor-led, it is not survivor exclusive. We work together and we make sure that our kids are getting what they need. Next slide, please. It looks like I'm done. Answer key questions.
Here we are at our questions, and thank you so much, Anne and Joy and Dejamir, for all of the incredible insights that you just shared. Yeah, you just gave a lot of different angles about this really important topic and all the different ways that we're engaging with young people. So thank you for all of your recommendations and insights. At this point, we wanted to use the remainder of our time to ask you some questions, and our participants submitted such fantastic questions. We could spend all day, and literally I mean all day, answering them because they were fantastic, but we did pull out a few that we felt like were really, really relevant to today's conversation that we thought a lot of folks might want to hear a little bit more about. So for the first question, I would like to ask if you all can share a little bit more, especially as we talk about the importance of language, right? And not, further marginalizing young people who are struggling by showing any kind of judgment. Can you help us understand what are some common triggers that might show up for young people who have experienced commercial sexual exploitation? So maybe emotional triggers or things that we should be watching out for as we try to support them or even talk to them for the first time about this topic.
Oh, I didn't know my mic was, sorry, I did not know I was unmuted. Trigger.
And keeps being like, why am I always the first one to?
I know. I think there are so many different ways that question could go, but I guess a trigger would be just, again, I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but language, how I communicate with you, how I respond to you. And I think Joy mentioned, sort of asking what happened, not sort of why or what's wrong with you kind of thing. And paying attention to some of the nonverbal cues. If a youth is really withdrawn, or their language is changing and they're starting to glamorize the sex industry. Right now, a lot of our young people, OnlyFans is something that a lot of young people may think is, well, I'm only doing a video, so hey, I'm not really doing anything. Well, that's a major trigger that she has somehow, or they have somehow got the understanding that their body is sort of like a tool, a thing, right? It's an object, and that it can be used in a way that could be harmful, even though there may not be anyone in the room. So it's just really paying attention to what they're occupying their time with, and how that can be triggering, just paying attention.
Thank you so much, Ann. Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead, Dejamir.
Yeah, can I add to that? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Because I was like, hey, you threw me off the question, threw me off a little bit. No, I think also just to add to like along the lines is like when like having that conversation or talking to youth about who experience or talking to youth about the triggers, right? Like, how do you talk to a youth who have experienced triggers, right? That I feel like what that comes with that work that you need to put in, like to understand what those triggers are that young person may have, because they may not even be aware of their own triggers that they have. Like you could say something like, oh, wow, like I didn't realize like that would trigger me in this moment. So I feel like that comes with that partnership that I always speak about, and really understanding that youth and young adult, and really understanding that trauma that young person has personally faced, to really understand what's going to trigger them in that moment. Because every youth and young adult that you personally come in contact with, they're not going to have the same triggers. Like everyone's going to have their own triggers. So just really working with that young person to, really understand like what is going to trigger them in that moment, and how to best navigate conversations. But like to Ann's point, definitely around language as well too. Just knowing how and what way to approach youth and young adults.
Yeah, and I would add just absolutely the things that Ms. Ann and Dejamir have shared, but I think also as adults, it's important for us to know what our triggers are and when we're triggered, in being able to kind of self-regulate and not be reactive because we are triggered. And so that's something that we talk about in that when we do kind of training on working with youth, is how to turn off those mirror neurons. Because right now, if I yawn, most of y'all who see me yawn, who are really tapped in, y'all are gonna yawn too. Or if we're watching a sad movie, we might start to cry together. That is not empathy. Those are mirror neurons. And so if we're not careful, when we see somebody else having a reaction, we will have the same reaction. And that's just human. That's how we care for each other. That's science. But how do we move beyond science into, okay, that is not helpful in this situation. It's not helpful for me to be reactive because you're reactive. It's helpful for me to be curious about what's going on with you so that I can notice. Now might be a time for me to put on my mentor hat or my service provider hat or my patient's hat or my human hat and just listen and figure out what is needed right now in this moment. I think that's important too. So being aware of your own triggers so that you can be present when other people are triggered is helpful as well.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for such great different takes on that question. It was a multi-layered question, so you've got it all different angles. Another question, and this is sort of two questions, but I'm going to combine it into one because I think it's all, different pieces of the same puzzle. But the question is, how do we hire or sort of market the opportunity or recruit, if we want to use that word, survivor mentors? So how do we find them? How do we recruit them for our programs? And then what is the hiring criteria? So what are you looking for in a survivor mentor? And I'm assuming this may be a question for Anne, but probably Joy and Dejamir, you may have some insight into this as well.
Okay, let me make sure I got this one. How to hire them, where to look. Okay, so the first thing is and anybody, I think you have information, but anybody who would like to really get into like having a survivor mentoring program, blah, 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 we could talk more about that in detail. You can email me or something and we could talk more in detail. But I'm going to give you a little snapshot of how we do it. So you just simply place an ad asking for a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. Anybody who is educated in that just a little bit will respond to that and you will know that they are a survivor. Now, the important thing is to make sure that you're looking at someone who's exited the field for many years. And so for us, at least 5 years out of the CSEC industry, or the sex industry. You've got to be at least 5 years out and sort of have done some self-care work or some therapeutic supports and done some things to sort of support your exiting. Again, we could talk more offline about the details of that, but that's kind of what you want to do. You want to have some parameters in place, and you want to probably be educated on CSEC, what CSEC is and what it isn't. Many people think because a person has had sexual abuse that is exploitation. They are not the same, although they are both horrible and abusive. They are not the same. And so CSEC is the commercial sexual exploitation. And I think Joy went over, but like you've had sex or you've danced or you've sold pictures or you've done something in exchange for a fee. And so you just want to be really clear about that. And people are amazed that there's a job for that. And so you will get responses to that. And I can, again, talk to you more offline about the screening process to hire survivors of exploitation, because it's tricky. I hope I answered the question. I did. Thank you, Delia.
Joy and Dejamir, any other thoughts?
I think that something that is important that I've seen is to figure out how to make it an environment that is comfortable and sustainable once you have survivors in it. So similar to what is happening now, where the nation is kind of like waking up to inequities of all kinds, and everyone wants to put out a statement and everyone wants to become more diverse. That's like the first step. But how do we prepare the environments to really nurture those folks? So we're not just hiring people because of their lived expertise, but we're hiring them because of the skills that they have, and they happen to have some lived expertise as well. So we don't want to set people up for disaster, and we also don't want to we want to hire people who can do the jobs, and we also want to be sure that we have representation in those jobs. So I think that that's important as well.
you so much. Okay. Well, another question that we have is, what kinds of resources are available outside of mentoring programs to help young people who are facing this issue, either at risk or currently involved in commercial sexual exploitation? What kind of resources would you recommend folks thinking about when they become aware of this?
Sure, so many. So when we think about like those target factors are where people, so the leading challenges I would say are age, obviously. So we're trying to reach youth, but also unstable housing. So one of the key partners that you'll need to have are drop-in centers and residential placements, because you'll notice that those who are working with youth who are impacted by unstable housing are also working with the same youth who are impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. And so being sure that you build kind of a safety net and network, because you're going to be dealing with youth who may be unstably housed, or the home that they're in is not safe. And mentoring is one of those things that work for this population, for people who are impacted by this. It works well in collaboration with all the other things that young people need to survive. So if you're not connected to a clinic that is providing health services for youth, you definitely want to build partnerships with them, or pediatricians, and things of that nature. You want to be connected, like I mentioned, to juvenile justice. You want to have some champions within juvenile justice who understand this issue deeply and are not coming at it from a punitive point of view. You also want to, someone mentioned about MDT, I think it was Miss Ann, that there's a multidisciplinary team in their area. There is likely a task force or an MDT team in your area that is already having these conversations. You want to get in on those conversations and start building those authentic relationships. And you want to build relationships, obviously, with community health, people who are receiving funding to offer services free of charge to youth and young adults and their families, so that you all can, provide that safety net and provide mentoring, but also know that you don't have to do it on your own. So there is a bit of a checklist, and we're happy to share that with Delia, so that she can share it with you all afterwards, about partnerships to consider if you're not already collaborating with folks in your area. You want to start thinking about creating a resource map. So here's who I know that can do this. This is where they are. Here's the point of contact for this program. And I'm happy doing and able to, any staff, if I were to leave this organization, what I know does not leave with me. So the staff who replaces me knows who to call and how to do the introduction and what paperwork is needed. Obviously we want the youth to not have to retell their story all the time to a whole bunch of people they haven't built authentic relationships with. So that's what I would share there. Feel free to chime in, Deshamir and Ms. Ann.
Oh, I think Deshamir, are you muted? No, nothing else to add. Okay. All right. We have two more great questions that just came in. The first one is one that you all have touched on, but I think just kind of really going a little bit deeper. It sounds like folks would really like to know, how do you begin to build back trust in people after someone has gone through such deep trauma related to exploitation? So how do you even start to go about rebuilding trust in people and in life, in some ways, you might say, with a young person who's experienced this?
Oh, so we're talking about the young person. I think you've got to practice a bit of patience, and again, supporting them from where they're at, and just being there, just showing up consistently, just being there and showing and proving to them that there are people who can show up and be there for you, that will hold you no matter what's happening, will hold on to you and not let go of you, and sort of, again, support you from where you're at, and be consistent. I think it's really important for the youth that experience this type of trauma to know that they are valued and that they are seen. And, simply just saying, I see you, and just being there, it speaks volumes. And to be purposeful and mindful when you are engaging with them. Again, it's not about you. as a survivor. And even though I'm using my expertise, I'm using it as a tool to support them. It is not something that I'm going to just blurt out and just give out. It's being very skilled and paying attention. And again, meeting them where they're at and showing up no matter what. And they will slowly over time, they will begin to build again, but not in your time. I mean, I think the biggest lesson I've learned is patience and just be there. And it will grow over time. I mean, I've met a youth who, it's taken like a year, and I showed up every single week, and it took quite some time for her to start to even disclose and talk about what was going on to get what she needed, because she didn't trust me. She didn't know me. And she has a right to determine when I have gained that trust. That's empowering for her. They need to be able to do that. And so, yeah, just meet them where they're at and stick there with them. That's my biggest mantra.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, I definitely just want to lift up the consistency. Like, can I talk, y'all? It's getting that time for me of the day. But no, I definitely want to lift up what you said, Anne, about just being there. Like, definitely, I think that was for me, the biggest thing, like in my career, like just having that consistency, like I'm there and just showing, like, despite all, like, and it's not going to be perfect either. It's going to be those trials and tests and everything that comes with it, right? But that constantly showing up and that constantly showing, like, hey, look, I'm sticking with you for in the long run. I think that was very highly important. But then also just like now thinking about, I don't know why I'm about to say this, it probably doesn't even involve with the question, but with that trust is also like that kind of boundary too that needs to happen too with it, because it can get like, you want to put all your time and effort and you want to, consistently like show up and just show that young person that you're constantly there for them. But then it's those boundaries that sometimes could be crossed. And then when it gets to be too much, like how would that affect? It could also, turn out to be an effect on that young person as well too. So just always like showing up, but just making sure that you also have those appropriate boundaries as well too.
And I would add that when we're thinking about like how do you trust people again, and just kind of keep in mind, if we're thinking of like Maslow's, that triangle kind of hierarchy of needs, and we think of that in terms of youth who have been impacted by this level of trauma, until those physical needs are met and until they are safe, the focus is not how do you trust other people. It's how do I live today? Like, how is today gonna go? Once you have a steady place to live, you're not exposed to such violence every day. You get past like the just surviving and existing, and then you can get into healing. And that healing process is different for everybody. I've heard people talk about it, that for some people it's 5 years, for other people it's 35 years. For some people, they don't ever really feel fully healed. And so that's very personal. But I think for us, it's important to understand, like we think about if you haven't leaned into stages of change and understanding the hierarchy of CSEC survival, I suggest spending some time getting to know that, because the relationships piece comes after the stability piece and the trusting other people. And it comes after you had a second to just be at peace. And that's what we're doing a lot of times in our programs and direct services, is like, okay, let us be, when I say fierce advocacy, I mean, what are we walking alongside them? Because they're the ones that are going through this. It may be difficult for us, but they're going through it. So as they go through this process, what are we doing to remove the barriers to their healing, to create that opportunity for peace, so they can decide what healing looks like and what trusting people looks like when they're ready to do that.
So much sense. Thank you all for just going a little bit deeper on that topic, because it's such an important piece of this work. Okay, I'm going to ask one other question that did just come through recently in the chat or in the Q&A. And I really like this question because it does build on a lot of what you started to share earlier about selecting the right folks for this work. But it's really about supporting them. So once you do recruit the right mentors, and those may include survivor staff as well as allied staff of your programs, how do you support them as they may be experiencing vicarious trauma through the work that they're doing? So how do you build in that support for staff and mentors that you feel like they're going to need to do this work well?
So I think I mentioned it in the presentation, but we have what's called a coach for every survivor on staff, that we have a coach for them. And for any staff that has any other, I would say, if they're experienced vicarious trauma, we would support them too. So the coaches are trained to help someone in their own survivorship, how to help them. Joy mentioned something about, like, you got to check yourself, you got to reel it in, like to help them recognize that, you know, something may happen in the moment. You're going to really have to use a bit of compartmentalization, right? And you're going to have to put your stuff to the side to work with this young person, right? And then once you're done and you're in your car and you're whatever, you can call your coach and sort of express yourself and get what you need. We also strongly suggest that everyone have their own self-care supports, whatever that is. And for every mentor, it's different. You know, I get teased. I love bubble baths. When I've had a long day, today is one of those days, I will have a bubble bath at the end of the day where I just relax for a moment, right? I also have therapy. You know, I'm an advocate for a clinical support. So I have many things in place. I have folks that I trust that I can talk to. So we strongly suggest, and we inquire in the hiring stages, we talk about self-care. What do you do for self-care? And we give a couple of scenarios of things to see, you know, how are you going to answer that? What do you do to take care of yourself? Burnout is not just a thought. It really happens. And so we want to prevent that, and we want people to be as healthy as they can be, right? So it's really important to encourage self-care. It's also important to allow a person a space to be able to say, like, as a survivor, this sucks, or this blah, blah, blah. You know, I went in this meeting and I was talked to with this tone because I'm a survivor, that I'm not equal to the other folks in the room. It's really helping even a survivor lift their voice and expertise in the field, and even lift up their professionalism and boundaries, as you know, as Joy was saying, just really learning how to be boundaried, but also again, using the core competencies of mentoring and teaching them in that way, and understanding that these lessons are over and over and over, and it's very repetitive, but it's just how you learn good boundaries. It's how you learn professionalism, and just really working with them. So we have a coaching component that again is offered to every single survivor mentor. And as they grow, and it changes the level that they use their coaches, but it really has been effective for us. And yeah, that's what we are doing.
The piece that I would add to that is something that keeps coming up in a lot of our conversations, is cultural humility, and just having humility. And Deshamir mentioned it earlier when she mentioned that everybody's experience is different. And so sometimes we have the alternative experience of people who, some people know a little bit, and then some people go through multiple 40-hour trainings and then feel automatically like we are the experts. And we are never the experts in anyone else's experience. And so getting all the training that we can, but also knowing that that doesn't mean that we have more expertise than the person who went through it, and we don't have anything to learn about what they require from us in order for the experience to be positive for them. So I love what you said, Ms. Ann, about creating supports. I also love having training for all staff, anyone, on what burnout, vicarious trauma, and compassion fatigue are, because many of us conflate them and think they're all the same thing, and they're not. There's different ways to mitigate them and different ways to recover from them. So being sure that people are aware of what they are, because we tend to, in this work, say, well, at least I'm not going through this terrible thing over here, so I'm okay. And then in turn, we end up having sustainability issues where people come into the work and get burned out and leave, and the wisdom leaves, and youth are not, don't have that continuum of care, that solid support, because we are not caring for ourselves in the work. So definitely want to be mindful of those things.
And I just want to add to, and also to provide supports too, if a person does need, FMLA, or if they need certain things, to really not judge them and shun them or make them feel like something is wrong. Again, as Deshamir so eloquently said, everybody's in different places and spaces. And so you may get triggered in such a way that you may need more in-depth clinical support, right? And you may have to just press pause for a moment. And I think having in your agency to really be able to pay attention and assess and support an individual to get what they need, even when the need might not look like what you think, like, let me put you back together so you can go to work. It may be a little more than that. So again, we practice what we are practicing with the youth that we serve to the employees of our agency.
So much. We have just a couple minutes left. And so I was hoping very briefly if each of you wanted to share one resource that you think folks should take a look at. And if you feel so inspired to maybe pop it in the chat, because we are getting tons of questions just around resources, both for screening mentors, supporting folks, talking about these topics with young people. So if there's one thing you had to recommend as a resource, what would it be? And maybe we'll start with Joy.
Sure. The chat, narrowing it down to one, I guess I would say start at the Youth Collaboratory Shining the Light Toolkit, and I'll drop the link for that in the chat.
Excellent. And I think it's here on our resources page too, which you all will have in the PowerPoint that's sent out next week. But Anne, would you like to share one?
I'm going to, like Joy, I'm going to say I would go to the My Life, My Choice site. And I think that training is like a key element for this. And so I don't see, you got to add mylifemychoice.org down there and just go in and learn about trainings and, just get some information if you want, even some consultation on how to hire mentors. Like, just talk to us, talk to us, talk to Youth Collaborative, like use the tools that we're offering because it's really important. It's really helpful.
Thank you, Anne. And how about you, Deshamir? What would you recommend?
Honestly, Joy took mine. I feel like the Shining Light Toolkit is just like so much in there. It's not like just one thing. Like it's so many different. It's like LGBTQ, you C-second boy, C-second girl. Like it's so much with that toolkit. Like there's not one thing to narrow down. So it's like I definitely second what Anne and Joy has said. Like I don't have anything additional.
That's perfect, especially since we're running out of time. So you nailed it. Well, I want to pause here and just thank our panelists so much for everything that you've shared. Joy, Anne, and Deshamir, you guys have just really, addressed so many different angles of this very multifaceted issue and the way that it affects young people that we work with, that we may not know that are facing these issues. So thank you so much for building this awareness and sharing resources and sharing insights so that we can be better prepared when a disclosure happens, when we become aware of something that's going on, we know what to do to help. So thank you all so much. Can't thank you enough. I'm going to go in and just share a couple of other resources with everybody before we wrap up. And I do want to also thank our amazing participants. Your questions blew us away with how many really relevant and wonderful questions. We wish we had more time today to address them, but hoping we can do more on this topic in the coming year because it certainly, unfortunately, is not going away. So we have a couple of resources here from the OJJDP NMRC. We've done some really interesting work in partnership with some OJJDP grantees, including Youth Collaboratory and My Life, My Choice. We've got some great resources, including a really in-depth research review on what works in mentoring for youth who have been impacted by CSAC. So we hope you take a look at that. It is really quite in-depth. So if you're looking for just kind of a deep dive, that's a good place to go. We also have a key topics page that gives you a brief overview or a brief summary of what do you need to know about how mentoring can support this population, as well as some other webinars, resources, things you can take a look at to kind of walk you through what you need to know. So check that out. Definitely check out the resources that everybody else shared as well. And then we really want to plug technical assistance and consulting, right? Because a lot of you have asked questions about how do I screen? How do I address this topic? How do I train on this topic? If you really want to do this work well, it's great to work with an expert, someone who knows this topic really, really well. And We here at the NMRC are able to match subject matter experts with programs who want that type of support to do some really in-depth consulting work at no cost to you, thanks to the generosity of the OJJDP NMRC. So we really want to make folks aware that you can request help for this and many other topics related to mentoring. And so there's instructions that you'll get in your PowerPoint on how to go about requesting that TA. So that's just one other resource. And thank you so much, Anne, for sharing your information in the chat. I'll also put another email address in there that you can reach out to if you have general questions, and we can get them directed to the folks that might be able to answer them. But just want to thank everybody again. Thank you so much, Anne, Dejamir, Joy, so much for all of this great information, and to our attendees today for your attention and your dedication to young people. So thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.